Looking into the female reproductive system, we're going to start with the anatomical structures and build into the physiology. Now from this view, this is a mid-sagittal view. What you can see already labeled, things like the anus, the rectum, we've dealt with that from the digestive chapter. You can see the urine bladder and the urethra. That was the urine chapter we dealt with. You can see the pubic symphysis. That was the skeletal chapter back in AP1. So all those play a part because they're structurally around the actual reproductive system. So let's start off here. We're going to notice the first thing is the ovary. Now notice the ovary seems like it's kind of hidden behind a structure. That's because the ovaries are more lateral from the midline. So you can't really see the whole thing here. Now around the ovary, you can see the fimbriae, those little finger-like extensions kind of going around it. That's going to be a portion or a region, as well as the infundibulum is a region of the whole uterine tube. So this whole tube is the uterine tube. From there, we're going to head down into the uterus. The uterus itself is covered by the perimetrium. From the uterus, we can head down into the cervix. Now the cervix itself is just this small region down here. But notice on each side, front and back, so anterior and posterior, we have these indents. Those indents are referred to as the anterior fornix on front and posterior fornix, what's in the back. From there, you head down into the vaginal canal. From the vaginal canal, we're going to head down to this small little gland down here. That is the greater vestibular gland. It's meant to secrete a clear liquid. The greater vestibular gland then will move forward and have the hymen here. That will be a membrane covering this area if it's present. Then the labia majora and labia minora, or the labia majora and labia minora. Those are going to be folds of skin. Labia minora is the inner, smaller fold, while labia majora is the larger outer fold. They're meant to help close off the opening to the vaginal canal. And then in blue over here, which is obviously not blue, but that's just the way it's drawn, is the clitoris. That's a dense clustering of nerve endings. So the clitoris. Now an interesting note on that, the clitoris is similar to the glans penis of the male system. They both develop from the same clustering of nerves. That's why both of them are highly sensitive and have a high amount of nerves, because they both came from the same tissue. Now looking into a posterior view of the same system here, it makes it a little easier to see the actual ovary and the collecting duct that is the uterine tube. So we have all these different ligaments. From the broad ligaments, which is this entire sheet on the one side, to the round ligaments helping here to hold the uterus in place. Those ligaments are all necessary because this ovary right here, it's not actually attached to the uterine tube just above it. It's actually floating. So it's important to maintain that distance to keep the actual ovary close to the uterine tube. That's what these ligaments are doing. So let's start with the ovary. You're going to have a right and left ovary. You can see both here. One is cut in a cross-sectional view. You then have the uterine tube. There are 4 regions to the uterine tube. You have the fimbriae, that's these little finger-like extensions. Those are the fimbriae. And that's what's around the actual ovary. From the fimbriae, you go to the infundibulum. Infundibulum region goes up to the ampulla region. Ampulla region goes all the way over to this isthmus region, which is all over here. Almost at the actual uterus. So 4 regions of the uterine tube. Now, the actual uterus itself, up top, is going to be the fundus. You might remember that term fundus when we talk about the stomach, just the top dome parts. Inside of the uterus is the lumen, that's the opening space. And then we have the main body of the uterus. But what's interesting, we have that same term isthmus coming down here. The isthmus is the end of the opening. Isthmus of the uterine tube, isthmus of the uterus. Now the uterus itself has 3 main layers. The endometrium is the inside layer, Myometrium is the middle layer, and perimetrium is the outside layer. We'll have to come back to those later, so keep that in the back of your minds. Then heading down into the actual cervix. The cervical canal is this opening right here in the middle. The start of the cervical canal, so basically uterus going into the cervix, is known as the internal os. And then the exit, going from the cervical canal out into the vagina, is known as the external os. And just like we saw before, these little indents on the side, those are called lateral fornix. So we have the anterior, posterior, now the lateral fornix. And they're all heading down into the vaginal canal. And the vaginal canal is what heads outside of the system. All right, so back to these ovaries we mentioned before. There's a whole lot that goes on inside the ovaries. So one of the things to look at is, what is the ovary itself? Well, it's made up of both a cortex and medulla. Now, there's no set definition of here's an easy line. Think back to the kidneys we talked about, that are curate artery and vein. Nice, clean definition of the two. In the ovaries, there's no set line. The outside is the cortex, the inside is medulla. In the cortex, on the outside, that's where all the follicles are, the eggs. The medulla is where you find the blood vessels, where you find the nerves. But we also have this all surrounded by a tunica albuginea. Think of it as a protective outer coating around the actual ovary. Now, those developing follicles, those eggs in essence, they're going to have basically referred to as oocytes, the actual genetic material. That's the gametes. Now, when they first start, you'll have follicular cells, one single layer of cells around the oocyte. But as they grow larger and mature, then we have the granulosa cells. That's when there's 2 layers or more. They become several layers as they build up. So we have different names depending on where the tissues are. The follicular cells, that first base layer supporting it, and then the granulosa cells building up as it matures. So the very first point is the primordial follicle. Now, the primordial follicle is the first stage. At this point, squamous-like cells around the oocyte. Primordial follicles are the very starting point. You'll have a couple of them selected, but usually only one makes the process. The next one from the primordial follicles is the primary follicles. At this point now, we're starting to develop a little bit. That means the surrounding cells are cuboidal or columnar. They're getting bigger. They're helping to develop the actual oocytes. From the primary follicle, we go into the secondary follicle. Secondary follicle, 2 or more layers of those granulosa cells. So they're starting to get larger, more layers around it. But then from this secondary follicle, we're going to go into the late secondary follicle. So, late, what's the difference? The late secondary follicle has a fluid-filled space. It's basically a central antrum. So the layers start to separate, and you see a little fluid-filled space between the layers. Now, from this late secondary follicle, this starting antrum, this little space, it's going to grow into a very large fluid-filled antrum. That's the vesicular follicle, sometimes known as the Graafian follicle. So the vesicular follicle, large fluid-filled space. Then, once that's mature enough, ovulation occurs. So that vesicular follicle, that was the last stage before ovulation. Now, ovulation is when the oocyte is basically pushed out from that developing cell, or the developing structure. Once ovulated, that oocyte should head up into the fimbriae and be pulled up into the uterine tube. I say should because sometimes it doesn't quite work there. If you ever heard of ectopic pregnancies, the egg, the oocyte didn't quite go in and went out and around for some reason. The leftover tissue after the ovulation, so all those other granulosa cells, start to develop into the corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum will become important but it's going to help with hormone control. We'll talk more about that later. All right, so let's take a look here. What we're seeing is one single ovary. At this point, you can see the cortex is where all the developing cells are. Medulla is where all the blood vessels are. All right, first thing, primordial follicles. Primordial follicles, one single squamous-like cell around them. They are the smallest, they are the base. From there, we develop into the primary follicles. You'll notice these primary follicles a little bit bigger. The cells are a little bit thicker around them. So it's not a huge difference, but they'll be just a little bit more along the maturation process. From the primary, we go to the secondary follicles. You'll notice in the secondary now, they're gaining extra layers, more layers of granulosa cells. They're maturing, they're getting larger. So that's the secondary follicles. The late secondary follicles, remember we said has that fluid-filled antrum starting. You can see right here, that is the start of a fluid-filled antrum. It's where the cells start to separate and you put a little fluid in between. From the late secondary, we go into the vesicular follicle, sometimes known as the Graafian follicle. You'll notice there's a very large fluid-filled antrum now. It's at this point, it's starting to kind of push out, because notice the ovary is bulging. So it's starting to push out, push away from the actual wall of the ovary. The next step is ovulation. Now, when ovulation occurs, notice that at this point, not all of the granulosa cells go with it. We have the actual oocyte, but a lot of these cells are left behind. They're not needed anymore. They're not necessary for the oocyte. They're still useful though, because those leftover cells become the corpus luteum. And that corpus luteum can help with hormone production. Now, that is this whole entire cycle going on inside of the ovary. Once that corpus luteum is no longer useful, so they're not needing the hormones anymore, it degrades into this little scar, this little tiny scar called a corpus albicans. Each ovulation leaves a remnant of a corpus albicans. So this little tiny pinpoint scar on the ovary. So as more and more ovulations occur, more and more little tiny pinpoint scars, corpus albicans, are occurring. All right, next video has to pick up with ovulation. A little about the different follicles, the different structures, and how to identify them.